Okay, hello, everyone. Welcome to the last TVS colloquium of 2023. We have the pleasure of having Tim Sacco here with us. He's a PhD in sociology and is currently a fellow at the LSST Alliance. No, he's a LSST Alliance Catalyst Fellow. Sorry for that. So he will tell us all about inclusive collaboration. So please take it away.
Great, thanks everyone. So thank you all for coming. My name is Tim Sacco. I'm a sociologist. I got my PhD from UMass Amherst in 2021. At the broadest level, my work focuses on the social and organizational dynamics of scientific work. In the past, I've centered the dynamics of research collaboration. So for instance, I've got a paper that explores how chemical scientists make sense of success or failure in their work. My work also focuses a lot on social inequalities in the scientific field. So for instance, I've got a paper that's under review right now that looks at the masculine culture of engineering and how that reinforces barriers to women's integration and inclusion in the field. From 2021 to 2023, I was a postdoc at NOIRLab, working on the US Extremely Large Telescope program. And I'm going to discuss my work on USCLTP a little bit later today. I am currently an LSST Discovery Alliance Catalyst Fellow, and I'm really happy to be here. So in this talk, I'm going to address how research collaborations can be organized to support diversity, equity, and inclusion goals in astronomy. Throughout, my overarching argument is that grant-making organizations or organizations with control over the resources needed to do research are uniquely poised to drive inclusion in astronomical collaborations. So how I've structured today's talk, I'm going to give a brief introduction to the scholarship on research collaboration, including its benefits, as well as the ways that research collaboration overlaps with inequalities in science. Then I'm going to give an introduction to some recent public policy scholarship that argues that grant-making organizations can drive inclusion in research collaborations. And then I'm going to provide two cases from astronomy. The first of these is NASA's Astrophysics Theory Program. In 2021, NASA ATP mandated that proposers submit inclusion plans to be eligible for funding from the program. An inclusion plan is a document that's designed to articulate how the proposed collaboration will align with or further DEI goals in the field. And then the second case is I'm drawing on NSF's NOIRLab's US Extreme Large Telescope program, who's also going to be mandating inclusion plans to be eligible for telescope time from the two observatories affiliated with the program once they're online. So these endeavors highlight how organizations with control over research resources can steer astronomical collaborations to more closely align DEI goals as a strategy to drive change in the field. So collaborations have been on the rise across STEM disciplines over the last 50 years. And this is in large part because there are a lot of benefits to collaboration. Collaborations bring together novel combinations of ideas and expertise. Often the scholarship on collaboration and the ways that it brings together different combinations of expertise and ideas is referencing interdisciplinary collaboration. But one thing that I find really interesting about astronomy is that it resembles interdisciplinarity a lot in the sense that it's not uncommon to have papers that have astronomers and astrophysicists, software engineers, data scientists, technicians, and others all coming together to make scientific contributions. Collaborations tend to have broader impact than sole authored work. Impact is typically measured in the scholarship through citations. Collaborations tend to have more citations than single authored papers do. And collaborations are generally seen as being more innovative than sole authored work. One paper that wasn't necessarily focused on astronomy found that diversity in a research team's expertise and network size were predictors of whether they would produce innovative outputs like patents. More diversity of thought and access to more researchers' social networks are precursors of innovation or disruptive science. So due to the benefits of collaboration, grant-making organizations, agencies like the National Science Foundation, NASA, the National Institute of Health, have increasingly supported collaborative work over sole-authored work over time. However, collaborations don't happen in a vacuum. There are stark inequalities in astronomy that affect the dynamics of collaboration. So let's look at some numbers first. These data are coming from the American Institute of Physics, and they show a persistent gender gap in earned astronomy PhDs over time. While the number of women in the field has increased steadily, the gender gap itself remains roughly the same. Similarly, Black and Latinx astronomy PhDs, or astronomy PhD earners, are far below the representation of these groups in the broader US population. So for instance, Black Americans make up roughly 12.6% of the overall US population, but they only represent 1 to 2 astronomy PhDs per year. And this has been pretty steady for a while now. And Latinx astronomers are Latinx folks, they make up 19.1% of the US population, and their share of astronomy PhDs are increasing, but they're still underrepresented in relation to their representation in the broader US population. The organization and team level dynamics of science then historically reproduce or exacerbate inequalities in astronomy and in other fields. So organizational arrangements tend to perpetuate disparities based on race, class, gender, or other axes of identity. This is true in workplaces both within and outside of STEM. How do organizations reproduce inequalities? This happens across a variety of different organizational processes. So take, for instance, recruitment. We know that personal networks have often played a strong role in hiring decisions. Sociologists that study networks argue that we tend to have homophilous networks, which means we tend to have stronger relationships with people who are similar to us in some way. There's that saying, birds of a feather flock together. What this translates to is when personal networks factor into hiring, it ends up privileging people that resemble those doing the hiring. Another is visibility, and by that I'm talking about dynamics around tokenism. Underrepresented team members often face increased opportunities due to their underrepresented status. They may be given leadership positions or more public-facing roles, but they also face more scrutiny and report in interviews that they often feel more under the microscope than their majority counterparts due to their minority status. Access to resources. Underrepresented groups tend to have less access to the resources needed to do their work in STEM. This translates to things like research funding, access to students or postdocs, or instrumentation. And we also see it around division of labor as well. Teams often unequally divide labor along race and gender lines, with more devalued work like mentorship or public outreach falling on underrepresented team members. At the team level, I'm going to take a minute here to plug some of my own work. In 2017, my co-authors and I were invited by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy to conduct a review of the scholarship on diversity in team science. Across STEM fields, the scientific workforce has become increasingly diverse, but we found a tension between teams becoming more diverse and teams becoming more inclusive. Teams have become increasingly diverse, which is a necessary condition for inclusion, but greater representation doesn't immediately translate to more inclusive scientific teams. Team dynamics around things like mentorship, division of labor, or even just the structure of team meetings can undermine inclusivity on the team. In this review, we encourage efforts to foster more inclusive team environments that will facilitate underrepresented scientists access to resources, information, and opportunities at the same rate as their majority colleagues. So organizations and team-level processes reinforce inequalities within STEM fields, including astronomy. What's to be done? So there's a growing public policy scholarship that argues within STEM, grant-making organizations like NASA or the National Science Foundation, are uniquely poised to drive change towards equity through their control over research resources. By tying progress in DEI to access to resources, grant-making organizations can then leverage their positions to enact change. Grant-making organizations also have advanced policy agendas. Grant makers have taken on policy not as a means, but as an end, using grant-making campaigns to instantiate ideas about diversity, equity, and inclusion goals into science policy and science administration. Thankfully, grant-making organizations have already begun implementing policies that tie research support to DEI goals. And a good example of this is this article from 2022, published by Hunt et al. It was published in Science, which reviewed the policies of 23 grant-making organizations from across 18 different countries to provide an overview of policies that have been implemented to drive DEI goals within the STEM field. Throughout their review, they make 5 recommendations for grant-making organizations that are looking to further DEI goals through their position. I've organized their recommendations into this table here, and I'm going to say a little bit about each one. So first, with the definition of terms, they encourage agencies to provide proposers with clear definitions for important concepts that should then be shared with applicants. Through clarity on what terms like inclusion, equity, or diversity mean, grant-making organizations set applicants up for success by making these expectations clear. It gives them the opportunity to rise to the occasion. They also urge grant-making organizations to determine when and how to mandate DEI policies, including when DEI will be suggested versus mandatory, or what instructions will be provided to proposers or even to reviewers. They urge grant-making organizations to develop clear and concise instructions for evaluators to ensure projects are succeeding or to figure out what needs to be improved over time in order for DEI goals to be met. Many applicants, evaluators, and administrative staff will need training in order for mandated policies to yield their desired goals. The authors argue that these trainings should be the responsibility of funding agencies because otherwise applicants will likely be receiving training through their host institutions like colleges or universities, and training content and quality can vary across context. This is an increasingly important point. In the past year, we've seen state-level anti-DEI laws get rolled out that have limited what efforts some universities and other workplaces can engage in. So if DEI is going to be a requirement as part of in order to be eligible for research funding or telescope time, it needs to have centralized support from the agency that's requiring these efforts. And then lastly, they encourage grant-making organizations to evaluate their own policy implementation in order to improve their effectiveness. So now I'm going to move into the 2 cases from astronomy that I'm going to focus on. I'm going to spend the majority of my time on this first case, NASA's Astrophysics Theory Program, but then I'm going to end the talk by discussing a little bit about the U.S. Extremely Large Telescope Program's efforts as well. So first, NASA's Astrophysics Theory Program. In 2020, NASA added inclusion as one of its core values. The others are teamwork, safety, integrity, and excellence. Then, NASA Astrophysics Theory Program mandated inclusion plans in 2021 in order to align the program with this new agency-wide value. Inclusion plans outline how the structure of a collaboration will further DEI goals. Specifically, in the context of NASA's ATP, these are 1 to 2 page documents that are submitted alongside research and data management plans. And these documents outline, first, plans for creating positive and inclusive working environments for those carrying out the proposed collaboration, and 2, plans for how the project would contribute to the training and development of a diverse and inclusive scientific workforce. Otherwise, the call during the 2021 cycle was vague, as program officers didn't want proposers simply regurgitating back what they thought reviewers would want to hear. I became involved with the program in fall of 2021. The program officer at the time asked Dr. Darren Norman and myself to analyze the inclusion plans as well as the evaluations of these plans that were submitted during this first round to better understand whether inclusion plans were an effective strategy for promoting inclusion goals in astronomy. NASA ATP gave us 120 inclusion plans. They gave us 2 sets of reviews of these plans. First, they gave us 117 reviews by astronomy panel reviewers, and then they gave us 120 reviews from a panel of DEI expert reviewers. We cut the 3 proposals and reviews we were missing from the astronomy review, so we ended up analyzing 117 total for consistency. And I want to pause here and talk about what I think is cool about the logic of how this was structured. They saw that astronomy needs to diversify and become more inclusive. NASA is working to move that goal forward. So NASA ATP program officer set up this experiment under the assumption that astronomy proposers and reviewers aren't where they need to be in terms of their education on and ability to carry out DEI goals. They used the DEI reviewers here as an experiment to highlight where the community should be, and then use that knowledge gap between where the community is and where the community should be if meaningful changes to occur, to design materials to move the community in that direction. For our review, NASA ATP program officers charged us with analyzing the distribution of key themes that were presented by proposals, and also with analyzing reviews of these inclusion plans, which gave us the opportunity to explore how different reviewers assessed these proposals. For the purpose of this talk, these data provided insights into NASA's ATP's effort to leverage its position to drive DEI goals in astronomy. I'm going to run through some of our analyses of these data and then come back to some of the takeaways for this case and what it means for today's talk. So we only had numeric scores from the DEI expert reviewers. The astronomy reviewer scores weren't separated from their proposal scores, so that's a little unfortunate for this comparison. But here's the score distribution as ranked by DEI expert reviewers. As is evident here, the DEI expert reviewers found inclusion plans were mostly marginal, with the distribution of scores peaking between good and fair. More proposals received scores on the lower end, with very few in the excellent or excellent-very good ranking. And this table has just some of the raw themes that were put forth by proposers. Given the general nature of NASA's proposal instructions, we found that PIs often focus their plans around activities that were the easiest to execute. So I just want to highlight a couple things. First, 22 proposals put forth a code of conduct. 64 proposals spent time outlining their DEI credentials, a theme that I'm going to get to in a couple slides. But proposers weren't necessarily putting forth practices that may best lead to advances in inclusion for the team or their departments. So we see only 4 proposals included a substantive evaluation plan with detailed assessments, and 5 proposals put forth efforts to leverage cross-institutional partnerships for DEI goals. We divided our comparison of the subjects and themes highlighted by reviewers into 2 categories. First, we analyzed how reviewers discussed pre-proposal activities or activities and practices in which proposers engaged in before their plans are submitted. Then we analyze how reviewers assessed aspects of proposed plans themselves in determining whether an inclusion plan would lead to greater inclusion in astronomy. I've got the yellow box here around DEI credentialing because that's the subject I'll be reviewing. I don't have time to review all of the themes covered in both pre-proposal activities and proposal activities, so I'm gonna be selective. So first, this theme of DEI credentialing. PIs often outlined their personal history with equity and inclusion efforts. The PIs of more than half of the inclusion proposals, 64 out of 117, attempted to outline DEI credentials to give validity to their projects. 44 out of 117 highlighted the PI's history with DEI to signal that the inclusion plan would likely work. It was also common for proposals to outline the institutional credentials of the environment in which the collaboration was going to be taken place in. So for instance, 30 of 117 proposals detailed institutional efforts at the university level to credential the project, while 22 out of 117 outlined department level credentials. So for instance, one proposal reported that its host department had eliminated the GRE requirements for graduate admissions, which had broadened the pool of graduate applicants, which in turn would shape the diversity of recruitment for the proposed collaboration. Another proposal details a department diversity and inclusion working group as helping to shape the environment in which the project would be conducted. DEI credentialing wasn't necessarily associated with a high or low score. So proposal W was ranked fair-poor, reported the PI's history of lecturing in a summer school with diverse students. Proposal X was ranked fair and reported a PI's history of including undergraduate and graduate students on research projects. Proposal Y was ranked very good and reported a PI had a history of mentoring women and people of color. Proposal Z, ranked good-fair, reported a PI commitment to DEI work in APS. But comparing assessments of DEI credentials was fruitful. So for instance, we got one of the proposals that was submitted, the PI states, we host a less formal weekly break where all students are encouraged to participate, to catch up and discuss about any topic they wish. Participation is not mandatory, as its intention is to promote collegiality, but not to favor some emotional or mentally disabled students. The PI here is talking about different groups of students that they work with, and also an informal weekly meeting that they hold as a way to build community in their lab. They provided these descriptions of efforts already underway to demonstrate that they were prepared and ready to carry out the proposed inclusion plan. In response, astronomy reviewers write, the PI mentions, quote unquote, emotional or mentally disabled students as being possibly disfavored by an informal weekly meeting, but does not provide any evidence to support the statement. Many other types of students may also be disfavored by these weekly meetings as well. In contrast, the DEI expert reviewers wrote, describing students as emotional or mentally disabled has compromised the inclusivity goal of the proposal altogether. Here we see the astronomy reviewers, they put emphasis on the evidence. They want to see the proof of the claim that's being made in the proposal. And also they highlight that other groups may be affected by the structure of the weekly team meetings being put forth in the proposal. In contrast, the DEI expert reviewers, they take a broader tone. How the PI described their students had undermined the potential for inclusivity of the plan, at least in their eyes. And the way that they phrase this signals the power difference between PIs and students that are preceding the inclusion plan. Moving on to analyses of some proposal activities themselves. Again, I don't have time to get to everything, but what I am going to focus on are discussions of institutional resources and partnerships, disconnects between practice and inclusion goals, and target populations and proposals. So first, with institutional resources and partnerships, the astronomy and DEI expert reviewers often struck a similar tone, though there were some minor differences. For instance, one proposal described its plan to leverage ties with an HBCU as a benefit of the project. In response, astronomy reviewers wrote, the HBCU connection were only mentioned with respect to the seminar series and courses that are not clearly related to the proposed project. The proposal does not sufficiently discuss the role of the PI and co-I in the coursework arrangement, nor how these efforts would connect to the proposed work. And in contrast, the DEI expert reviewers wrote, the inclusion plan did not detail the extent of the involvement of HBCUs in the proposed work and how this involvement would promote a more inclusive scientific workforce. Both assessments here focus on the involvement of the HBCU in the proposed work, but highlight different aspects of this. Astronomy reviewers critique the lack of substantial discussion regarding the role of principal investigator and co-I in integrating HBCUs into the proposed project. It points out the absence of clear connections between the seminar series, courses mentioned, and how these efforts would relate to or contribute to the proposed work. In contrast, DEI expert reviewers focus on the absence of details about how the involvement of HBCUs would contribute to creating a more inclusive workforce broadly. They note that while the plan mentions HBCUs, it lacks specifics on how this involvement would directly contribute to fostering inclusion within the workforce related to the proposed project. Both assessments highlight the need for a more detailed and explicit discussion regarding the roles of HBCUs in the proposed work, but astronomy reviewers focus on how the connection of HBCU efforts align with the project, while DEI experts emphasize the connect the plan to fostering inclusivity within the workforce more broadly. A focus on disconnects between practices and goals was common. So this is when the project details didn't necessarily align with the goal in some way. So for instance, one proposal mentioned that if funded, it would be implementing a DEI journal club to foster inclusion on the team. In response, astronomy reviewers wrote the proposal mentions regular discussions of a DEI issues via the journal club, but it does not include information on whether the PI and their mentees will participate. And the DEI expert reviewers write, the plan does not adequately explain how it would ensure that a junior person of color would not be overly relied upon, given that graduate students are responsible for holding bi-weekly journal clubs on STEM-related diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So here, the astronomy reviewers, they critique the lack of information about the direct participation of the PI and their mentees in the DEI journal club. It questions whether the PI and their mentees are involved in these discussions, which are mentioned in the proposal. And in contrast, the DEI expert reviewers highlight a concern about the potential over-reliance on a junior person of color within the context of STEM-related DEI efforts. It expresses worry that people of color will be made responsible for leading bi-weekly journal clubs on DEI issues, potentially burdening them with excessive responsibilities. This goes back to this issue of tokenism that I was talking about during my initial discussion. So the DEI expert reviewers here are again moving beyond rules and questioning how the plan will address pre-existing power inequalities common to team science. And focusing on target populations, inclusion plans often stated their desire to serve underrepresented minority scientists in astronomy. So in response to one proposal that said it would recruit from a diverse group of candidates, astronomy reviewers wrote, the plan includes a statement that the collaboration will seek out a diverse array of candidates for research opportunities at their host institutions. However, the plan does not sufficiently describe how this will be achieved, inclusive recruitment, selection processes, or whether it is a feasible expectation with the demographics of the host institution or department. And in contrast, the DEI expert reviewers wrote, the proposed plan lacked an adequate discussion of inclusion of multiple axes of diversity to foster innovation and creativity. Without addressing multiple dimensions of diversity, the potential to have an inclusive working environment for the team members may be limited. So here the astronomy reviewers critique the lack of detail regarding the implementation of a diverse recruitment strategy. It points out that while the plan acknowledges the need for diverse candidates, it falls short in explaining how this goal will be achieved, especially considering the demographics of the institution. In contrast, DEI experts highlighted a broader concern about the plan's discussion regarding diversity. It suggests that the plan does not adequately address various dimensions of diversity, which could hinder the creation of an inclusive environment for the team members. It focuses on the potential limitations in fostering innovation and creativity due to the lack of consideration for multiple diversity axes. While both assessments address the issue of diversity and inclusion within the plan, they approach it from different angles. Astronomy reviewers are focused on the specifics of the recruitment strategy and feasibility, whereas DEI experts take a broader view, emphasizing the importance of addressing multiple dimensions of diversity for fostering an inclusive team environment. And one more from target populations, there was one proposal that mentioned that the PI endeavors to stay informed about opportunities to promote the careers of all their advisees, including programs intended to support the careers of diversity applicants. Astronomy reviewers praised the plan and made no comment about the mention of diversity applicant language used in the proposal. In contrast, the plan's use of the term diversity applicant separates specific applicants from others, implying they are not held to the same standard. So in contrast, DEI experts criticized the plan for how it wrote about underrepresented candidates for the position, for which they'd be potentially hiring. The language implied inequality in the selection process, which then undermined the inclusivity goals of the proposed plan. So for some conclusions from this first case, proposers were generally unprepared to write adequate inclusion plans, at least in the eyes of the DEI experts who gave them numeric scores. They ranked more marginal. There was very few in the excellent or excellent-very good ranking. And without direction, specific direction from the NASA program officers, proposed activities tended to focus on those that were easiest to execute and not necessarily those that would lead to best advances in inclusion, at least those things that the literature highlights as being aligned with what would bring about more inclusion in the field. For reviewers, when we initially did this study, we anticipated there would be greater differences in science, or in the astronomy reviewers and the DEI expert inclusion panel reviews. But the astronomy panel reviewers often match the overall sentiments expressed in reviews provided by the DEI expert panel, in the sense of the ones that the DEI expert panelists saw as bad proposals, the astronomy reviewers also often saw as bad proposals. However, each group honed in on different elements of the proposal to question and critique. Astronomy reviewers often focused on specific rules and details, whereas DEI expert panels often sought that proposals would connect their work to broader discussions of power and inequality in the field. Revisiting these recommendations made by Hunt et al., I want to highlight a few. They emphasize the importance of diversity of terms and proposal guidelines. NASA ATP were vague in the instructions that they gave to proposers, as they didn't want them to just be regurgitating back what they thought reviewers would want to hear. Given the general nature of the proposal instructions, as I was just talking about, PIs often focus their plans around the activities that were easiest to execute and not necessarily those that would lead to the best advances in inclusion for their teams or departments. NASA ATP provided few instructions for reviewers. The program officer saw the DEI expert reviews as where the astronomy field should be in its ability to assess quality inclusion plans, and they provided no instructions or trainings for reviewers, astronomy reviewers, which then led to potentially a significant gap between review panel assessments. And then I want to draw attention to the evaluation of policy implementation. As I said, the cool thing about how they did structure this first round of inclusion plan submissions was they structured it as an experiment where they wanted to assess the gap between where the astronomy community is or was in regard to their education on DEI issues and where they felt they should be. And so that's why they organized this DEI expert review panel. Based on these findings, NASA program officers then have begun to provide additional resources and instructions for both astronomy proposers and astronomy reviewers. So for instance, they have since developed a rubric that they provide to both proposers and reviewers. And the rubric provides concepts and definitions, creates a standardized expectation for proposers and reviewers to follow. And it gives reviewers a reference to use in their assessment, something to look back on. They've also compiled this inclusion plan page of resources that includes white papers, reports, peer-reviewed articles, and other things that would be useful for reviewers. And then finally, last year, they organized an inclusion plan workshop. They got together a panel of experts that provided the community with instructions, best practices, and took questions from members of the community that they had about writing inclusion plans for NASA. So I want to use my last 10 minutes or so to discuss US Extremely Large Telescope Program's efforts. So the US ELTP is a joint initiative that plans to provide the entire US astronomical community with access to the Giant Magellan Telescope in the Southern Hemisphere and the 30-meter telescope in the Northern Hemisphere. Through an open peer review process facilitated by NSF's NOIRLab, US ELTP plans to provide US scientists with at least 25% of the observing time on these observatories once they're complete. As part of the application for telescope time, US ELTP also plans to require observing proposals submit inclusion plans alongside their science and data management plans. However, based on my analysis from NASA ATP's inclusion plans, it's clear that astronomers are not prepared to adequately write or assess inclusion plans. Thus, a major deliverable of US ELTP's Research Inclusion Initiative is a toolkit of collaborative practice, which will provide the community with a framework for writing and assessing research inclusion plans. The toolkit provides proposers with best practices that can be implemented in research inclusion proposals. And in addition, it also gives a framework that can guide reviews of inclusion plans. I mentioned at the top of this presentation that I previously worked for USCLTP. I actually developed this toolkit of collaborative practice under the supervision of Darren Norman in the 2 years that I was there. We released version 1 of the toolkit in March 2023 and version 2 of the toolkit in August 2023. And we're currently undertaking some efforts to continue improving that, even though I'm no longer at NOIRLab. So when you log on, this is what it looks like. There are filters for sorting by topic and theme, who the given activity is suggested for. I'm going to cover briefly how proposers can use the toolkit and then give a little more information on how reviewers of inclusion plans can use the toolkit in their assessment. And just as a side note, there's this QR code here. I'm going to have it on the next few slides. If you're interested, it will take you to the US ELTP Research Inclusion Initiative website, which has a link to the toolkit there. So first, for proposers, the toolkit provides definitions of terms and concepts, not just broad terms like inclusion, but it provides a conceptual framework for building an inclusive collaboration that fits their broader project. There are a lot of recommendations here, but all collaborations are different. The toolkit then provides a menu of sorts for proposers to find the right practices to implement in their own project. It's unrealistic that a collaboration would implement everything, all the content that is in the toolkit. It's more meant to be selective, but hopefully comprehensive enough that everyone can find the right tools and strategies for organizing their collaboration. The toolkit provides proposers with best practices. It translates concepts like mutual mentorship, recruitment, or inclusive environments into actionable best practices that they can draw on. It also provides metrics. We know that assessment is important for understanding whether a collaboration is fulfilling its inclusion goals. And the toolkit has a column that outlines metrics for each activity that could be implemented, providing proposers with the necessary resources to ensure goals are being met. So then our toolkit benefits reviewers of inclusion plans in a couple ways. First, through the organization of the best practices of a given activity. So let's just use student mentorship plans as an example. Research suggests that students with good mentorship have higher rates of success, and this is especially true for students from underrepresented identities. Here, the best practices are organized so the top line suggestion is the minimum for an activity, while the lower components are more advanced components of a plan. So for student mentorship plans, the minimum is having students affiliated with the project fill out an individual development plan, which is a living document that helps students identify their professional goals and identify pathways to achieve those goals. Individual development plans are good, but they're also student-led and allows faculty to be less engaged if they choose, which is why it's listed here as a bare minimum. Other suggested practices build on this foundation. So for instance, identifying specific activities on the project for students or identifying specific mentors on the project that will work alongside the student, make the mentorship plan stronger than it would be if it was just the IDP alone. In another example, using time expectation plans are especially important in collaborations that span multiple institution types. We know that faculty at Research One universities and faculty at teaching colleges have different responsibilities around teaching, research, and service. So differing responsibilities and time commitments are often a source of tension on collaborations, often to the detriment of faculty at non-R1 institutions. So the top line suggestion here is to communicate the time expectations of the different team members And it's really the minimum for the time expectation plan. It ensures that everyone knows what everyone else's responsibilities are. Other recommendations: identifying times when collaborators can meet in person, using Gantt charts to organize when certain members of the team will be accomplishing collaboration-related tasks, make the initial time expectation plan stronger. By following the organization of the toolkit best practices, reviewers have a guide that will help them assess how developed or effective a proposed plan might be. Even if a proposal puts forth a time expectation plan that looks different than what's proposed here, the reviewer can use these practices as a comparative case in their assessment of a proposal in order to determine if the plan being proposed is effective or if it could be better. And the second way that the Toolkit of Collaborative Practice will benefit reviewers of inclusion plans is by providing suggested metrics for most activities in the toolkit. This was not part of our version 1 rollout in March of 2023, but it was part of version 2, and we're still improving it. But we have this example metric column that gives recommendations for what could be studied in order to assess a given practice, as well as a suggested research methodology for collecting data. So for instance, for a communication plan, a year into the project, designated members of the team could interview or survey team members to investigate whether their expectations of professional communication on the team are being met. Or a second, for communication, the team could document conflicts on the team to better understand what types of communication most likely lead to tensions or conflicts between team members. They can then use these data to make team communications more inclusive. The metrics we're putting forward are examples for practices outlined in the toolkit, and this column will help reviewers because even if a proposal is putting forth practices that are not in the toolkit, reviewers have enough information here to assess whether they have similar adequate metrics for what they're proposing. Our toolkit provides reviewers with the information to review an array of practices and activities, not just those in the toolkit. So in this talk, I've addressed how research collaborations can be organized to support diversity, equity, and inclusion goals in astronomy. Research collaborations are all different in size, structure, and focus, so there's no one right way to organize a collaboration in order to support DEI goals. However, all collaborations need resources in order to do their work. I've argued that grant-making organizations, or those organizations with control over the resources needed to do research, are uniquely poised to drive inclusion in astronomy collaborations. Grant-making organizations have the ability, and some would argue the responsibility, to provide proposers with the resources needed to construct inclusive collaborations. And they can outline clear terms, guidelines, or instructions for proposers, reviewers, and evaluators. They can provide necessary trainings and internal evaluations to ensure programs are being designed to further DEI goals are actually working. And I've highlighted the efforts from both NASA's Astrophysics Theory Program and USCLTP that shows how grant-making organizations in astronomy are currently attempting to leverage their position in astronomy, as well as how they're working to support the astronomical community in organizing and reviewing more equitable collaborations. With that, I appreciate your time, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Tim. This is not only great work, but also very necessary. So thank you again for agreeing to present with us.